Hi everyone, welcome back to Hazel's Flight School, Beer Edition. I'm Lily Margolis,
I'm Josh Gosnell.
and today we're answering your burning beer questions. The first question that I have for you today is it okay for my beer to get warm and then cold and then back again? Is that a problem?
Not typically. Ideally, beer should be stored cold. It slows down the fermentation process. It'll keep your beer fresher for longer. However, you'll notice that we have stacks of beer, displays, pallets of beer out on the floor at room temperature. This is acceptable, but again, we should store our beer cold as often as possible. We go through a lot of that, moving beer into and out of the cooler as needed. With that, it even comes from our distributors, from the breweries, from the shipping companies. It will go from warm to cold a number of times before it ever reaches our door. What you want to avoid in those situations is temperature extremes. If you've put a beer in the freezer and forgotten about it, you'll know exactly what I mean. You want to avoid freezing the beer. That will cause some of the protein, some of the flavor to fall off. You get it too hot, it will make that yeast overexcited and produce some off flavors in that as well. This is why we can cellar beer, certain beers that are meant to be enjoyed even years or even decades after the fact, after their bottling. So with that, cool, dark, dry place.
And if I am storing my beer, how long is that beer going to last?
Again, it really depends on the beer style. You'll see that a lot of beers have either a canned on or an enjoy by, a best by date. This isn't a hard fast rule necessarily. Most beer is meant to be enjoyed fresh. Your IPAs, for example, some will have a 3 to a 6 month shelf life on them. What happens over that lifetime, though, is you get that bright hoppy character, and over time, those hop flavors, those hop notes start to fade. So you'll essentially be left with just kind of a malty, sweet imitation of an IPA. You won't get as much hop flavor as if it were fresh. However, with some styles like stouts, for example, barrel-aged stouts in particular, you'll see flavors develop. If they were barrel-aged, you'll see that barrel character change a little bit. You'll get less notes of vanilla and sometimes more coconut flavors. There will be some minor oxidation to it, so you'll start getting more savory notes. A lot of people get soy sauce out of some big barrel-aged stouts, just the savory umami character out of it. And with certain sours, especially using wild yeasts and wild cultures, they will continue to develop over time, especially ones with Brettanomyces. They will develop almost indefinitely. And you'll see that flavor start to change. It'll add some complexity to it. It may mellow out some of those sharper sour notes, or it can expand upon them. They can get even more pronounced. And with those, I would say just double check your labels. A lot of them will have a suggested enjoy by date. There's also nothing wrong with pushing past that a little bit. Your beer's not going to curdle like milk. It's not going to go sour unless it is a sour. And your beer will still be drinkable. It's not really going to hurt you. It may not just be as enjoyable as you or the brewery produced them wants it to be, as if it were fresh.
Gotcha. For maximum enjoyment, enjoy your beer fresh. Let's move on to the next question. Can I get blank beer ordered for me? And let's use New Glarus as an example for this one.
So, there's a lot that goes into us getting beer here in the state of Colorado, here in Boulder in particular. We have what's called a 3-tier distribution system. So, producer, distributor, retailer. In general, that's the path that any product that wants to be in our store and into your hands has to take. It has to be made by somebody. It has to be distributed to our state, to our area in particular, for us to be able to buy it, for you to enjoy. Now, there are a couple exceptions to this rule. One is a self-distribution exception. We get a lot of our local beers direct from the source, direct from the brewery themselves. Not always the case. If it's an out-of-town brewery, say New Glarus, for example, which unfortunately is not distributed outside of Wisconsin. So, as that example, you can only get it in Wisconsin. That means I cannot order it. They will only deliver to Wisconsin. Now, with other beers, like I was saying, the self-distribution, I'm not going to get a brewer from California who's self-distributing to Colorado. That's a heck of a long time. They'll keep that more kind of localized. If you're in San Diego, there'll be some self-distributed stuff in San Diego. We're here in Boulder, we get some stuff self-distributed from across the Front Range.
And Hazel's does not ship alcohol at all. We do deliver if you're within our local radius, but we cannot ship to you even if you live in Colorado, and especially if you live out of state. What's the difference between craft and domestic beer?
It's kind of a general term, but by the Brewers Association's definition, kind of wouldn't necessarily say governing body over craft beer, but kind of one of the main authorities on it. Their rules are under 6 million barrels per year, which is kind of a high bar. Also, less than 25% ownership or investment from an outside stake that is not also a craft brewer. So essentially with that, the Brewers Association is trying to keep the independent craft beer logo and that distinction to small, independent, locally owned sort of breweries. And as for the domestic side, we can think domestic of kind of your macro lagers, your Budweiser, your Miller Coors, some to that kind of level that are nationwide. They're kind of ubiquitous with, beer across the nation. You can find Budweiser or Coors pretty much anywhere you go. Those are kind of our domestic or our macro breweries.
So all craft is domestic, but not all domestic is craft.
Yeah. So yeah, it's domestically made, but we say domestic kind of to denote that larger macro-sized brewery.
Okay. So Josh, let's say I buy a beer from Hazel's, I'm opening it, and I notice some sediment in my bottle. Is that okay to drink?
Yes and no. So essentially what that will be is a number of things. It can be either just dead yeast cells that just kind of sink to the bottom. It could also be other things like longer chain proteins that you get from the brewing process that just kind of come out of suspension. Now, can you drink it? Yes. It's not really going to do you any harm. In fact, I've heard some people say that drinking that little bit of yeast is good for your gut health. I'm not a doctor. I'm not saying this is any sort of medical advice, but it's something that I've heard that can kind of help you with that. On the other hand, too, it can create some like autolysis or some like dead yeast cell sort of taste to it, which can be a little off-putting. A lot of New England style IPAs will have a little bit of that sediment. And some of them, they either recommend that you roll it, swirl the beer around, just reincorporate that all into the beer. It gives it kind of a little bit more body. Or if having that sediment, sometimes it can feel a little chewy, like a little sandy in your beer almost. Some people recommend just leave that last half ounce pour in the bottom of the can, in the bottom of the bottle. Leave it be, toss it. They aren't going to be offended by it. Another thing, too, is with some of these more complex sours, your gooses, your lambics, some of these, I've had one of our regular customers will take that little bit of yeast from these really fun sours. They'll propagate that yeast into a sourdough starter, and they'll actually make bread with it, and it's come out incredible. So it's not all lost in the bottom of the bottle. And same thing there. Drink it or not, that's there for you to decide.
I have a friend who's allergic to wheat. Does all beer have wheat in it?
Not necessarily. So wheat is used in a lot of beers either as kind of the driving flavor in, say, a Belgian wit or a German Hefeweizen, for example. Otherwise, it can also be used in other styles of beer as a way to greaten the head retention of a beer. It has certain proteins in there that keep that head there, that help with that head retention. So now we go from wheat to gluten. Now, gluten is in basically all beer. So we have barley, rye, wheat, oats. We have gluten within a lot of these beers, if not all of them really. There are a couple different ways that we get to gluten-free or gluten-reduced beers. So one is they'll use any number of enzymes that'll essentially make all of that gluten clump together and fall out of suspension. So like we were talking with the sediment before, it would do a similar sort of thing, but it just attaches to those gluten molecules and they fall out. So when you see a beer that says gluten reduced or crafted to remove gluten, it's because they're using one of these enzymes, and to say that on their label, it has to be under 20 parts per million. Now, as I tell most of my customers, if you are sensitive to gluten, if you have celiacs, I don't necessarily recommend gluten-reduced beers. Some people, they say they can drink it just fine. I don't recommend it to people who are looking for gluten-free beers. Now, gluten-free beers use different sort of malts. They use sorghum, millet, buckwheat, some of these other sorts of grains that don't contain gluten. So they will have a little bit different flavor to it, but you get more than a few producers out there that make a darn fine beer with 100% gluten-free grains. So again, if you are gluten sensitive, gluten intolerant, have celiacs, do your own research, know your own body to that, but know the difference between gluten reduced, crafted to remove gluten, and gluten free for your own safety, for your own health and protection, for sure.
Thanks for flying with us today. If you have any other burning beer questions, please ask them in the comments and make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Today's trivia question is, what is the difference between craft and domestic beer? Be the first person to answer this trivia question in the comments to receive a $10 Hazel's gift card.